He was probably drinking heavily at most stages in his adult life.
He liked being around young women.
The Nazi mass rallies are essentially theatrical stagings.
Tolstoy is the archetypal repentant nobleman.
It's basically absorbed into Macbeth.
His father, his uncles, his grandfathers, they all die. No role models.
Welcome to the Canon Club with Paul Morland and Ed West, exploring the Western canon in art, music and literature, one life at a time. This week,
at the end of the day, we are dealing with a story about a 50-year-old man who falls in love with, if I remember correctly, a 14-year-old boy. There's something decidedly problematic about that. The very things that made German culture great were able, in a sort of twist of the screw, to be perverted into evil. In the confines of the allegory, Thomas Mann had a deeply tragic view of the world. You'd be hard-pressed to find stories and novels by Thomas Mann that end happily.
Thomas Mann.
Today we're talking about Thomas Mann, one of the most celebrated novelists of the early 20th century. Winner of a Nobel Prize in Literature, Mann's life and career spanned the course of Germany's tragic half-century. From the belle epoque of his best-known work, Death in Venice, through his disillusionment with Wilhelmite Germany's war aims, conflict with a communist brother, marriage into a converted Jewish family, the radical sexual mores of Weimar, and, of course, the rise of Hitler. Forced into exile, he would become perhaps the most prominent German anti-Nazi working for the English-speaking Allies and, like most of his family, find work in the United States, where he would later suffer a far milder falling out with the conservative political establishment. Tobias Boes is a professor of Notre Dame University in Indiana and an expert on German culture history. He is also the author of Thomas Mann's War. So Tobias, I would like to start in sort of flashback style with 1939, 1940, which is where your book basically sort of starts, and Mann's working for the Allies, which is unusual for German, to sort of explain how this sort of famous novelist got to this situation where he was working for the enemies of his own country.
It's a really interesting story because Mann started his life as very much a political conservative and a supporter of the German Empire prior to the First World War. And even throughout the First World War, was strongly supportive of the status quo, was strongly supportive of the monarchy. So he's really not somebody whom you would expect to have ended up in the place that he ended up in the late 1930s. A lot of the intellectuals of his generation that took similar positions as he did converted to fascism over the course of the 1920s pretty easily. But that's not what happened to Thomas Mann. And partly that has to do, I think, with just personal integrity and strength of character. Mann in 1922 famously embraced the Weimar democracy in a public lecture that he gave at the time in Berlin. That caused him a lot of trouble, because his conservative friends were sort of outraged by what he said there about liberal democracy as a desirable good for the Germans. And then over the course of the 1920s, advanced more and more into that same direction until he ends up as an anti-fascist in the early 1930s, and in fact has to leave. I mean, he's already outside of the country when Hitler comes to power, but he cannot return to Germany in 1933 because of his past political views that he voiced in the 1920s. After a stay in Switzerland, he eventually leaves and ends up in the United States and takes up his anti-Nazi activities there. And what I try to explore in the book is, in addition to the personal sort of the integrity that Mann had that caused him to move in that direction, what were sort of the structural factors? What made it possible for him to pull off such a radical career turn? Why did Americans not dismiss him based on his past writings? What I found was that it has a lot to do with the changing face of publishing in the 1920s and 1930s and the changing way in which an international community conceives of itself. In the early 1900s, a stable international copyright regime comes into place. Publishers are suddenly interested in marketing authors on an international level. And Mann was an eager participant in that development and used various strategies very carefully to very selectively curate his image, so that by the time that he arrived in the United States, his image in America was a very different one from the one that he had built for himself in Germany. And that allowed him to have the kind of career that he did and really have an impact in the early 1940s, I think, on America's perception of Germany.
And how did he have that impact? What was the effect? How did a shift occur in America's view of Germany because of Mann's writing and broadcasting?
The first thing that happened is that in the 1920s, America was pretty much a tabula rasa. There was an ascending middle class in America that was looking for intellectual models to satisfy its curiosity about the world. America had been more or less an isolationist country prior to the First World War. Not a lot of interest in European affairs, not just on a governmental level, but also amongst regular people. That began to change in the 1920s. Thomas Mann's American publisher realized that he could fill that void by very strategically marketing Thomas Mann as somebody who spoke to the European post-war spirit. Mann was more than happy to commit to that and have his public appearances in the United States, which start in the early 1930s, be sort of heralded under that rubric. And then by the time that Americans become interested in Nazism very specifically, which is in the mid-1930s, Mann is already in exile in Switzerland and thus lends himself to very easily be cast to an American audience as the kind of figure who can speak to the Nazi regime, to the suffering that the Nazi regime has caused, and can proclaim an alternate viewpoint. And that Mann was really very eager to do that as well and wrote his lectures accordingly. And so beginning in 1938, he sort of embarks on a US town hall lecture circuit and begins reaching out to American audience beyond his fiction and giving all these lectures on topics like why liberal democracy will ultimately be triumphant against fascism, why appeasement is a bad idea, what once the war breaks out, what the Second World War might mean for the future of Europe and the future of the world. So these are all sort of non-literary topics that he now speaks on, that he's able to speak on because of intense marketing efforts that have preceded him for 15 years.
And then after the war, thinking back to the period after the First World War and the catastrophe, economic and political, that followed that, it seemed to be the consensus that we had to do something differently. And that meant rebuilding Germany, which was an industrial and economic exercise. But I suppose it was also a cultural exercise. And then Thomas Mann was there very handy to participate in that exercise of rehabilitating Germany and reminding the world of another Germany. Do you want to tell us something about his role in the post-World War and Cold War period? First of all, reconstructing Germany culturally, and then how he fitted into the Cold War.
Already before the war ended, a lot of people thought about, okay, what will come next? What do we do with Germany? How do we rehabilitate Germany, perhaps? How do we educate it towards a democratic culture? And there were people in the United States who went so far as to propose Thomas Mann as the possible president for a future Germany, by which I think, these plans were very vague. I don't think they meant that Thomas Mann might actually take over as a political leader of Germany, but in the way that the Bundespräsident is in contemporary Germany, is largely a symbolic figurehead, right? Perhaps more closely comparable to the Queen in England than certainly to the president in America. I think that kind of symbolic role is what people in the United States envisioned for Thomas Mann. That never went anywhere. I think it's a rather bizarre idea anyway. But once the war was over, that discussion about, okay, where do we go now and what do we do with Thomas Mann became relevant in Germany as well. Of course, before the war ended, nobody would have dared to publicly discuss what comes after Nazism. Here we have to differentiate between the western half of Germany and East Germany, what would eventually become the German Democratic Republic, because the two states had very different ideas. In the German Democratic Republic in socialist East Germany, Thomas Mann, because of his anti-fascist activities and probably also because his brother had been a prominent supporter of socialism, was seen as somebody who might be won over to the communist cause, who might be won for East Germany and brought there. That was certainly not something that Thomas Mann ever seriously considered, although he got himself into hot water with the Americans by agreeing to speak in 1949 on the occasion of 200th birthday of the great German poet Goethe. He went to Weimar, where Goethe had lived for much of his life, and gave a public lecture there. And that certainly was great news for the communists in East Germany and not so great news for the Americans, who were very, very mad at him for doing that. In West Germany, there was sort of a mixed reception because it took Germany very long to really come to terms with the sins of his past, right? That is really something that didn't happen until the late 1960s. Between the end of the Second World War and then the student generation in the 1960s, the Nazi crimes were basically swept under the rug, right? Nobody really liked to talk about that. And so Thomas Mann was a highly ambivalent figure. On the one hand, clearly a great author, somebody who might be used to win prestige for Germany in the post-war order. But then on the other hand, somebody who had spent the war in America, who wasn't there when Nazism actually happened, and who didn't shy away from condemning people who had, not only people who had supported the Nazis, but also who had gone into what was called at the time inner exile, who had not spoken out, who had just sort of stuck to their writing desk, written novels, and not really commented on the regime. Thomas Mann was harshly critical of that. And Germany for a long time was deeply ungrateful for what he had done. And it's really only since the 1960s that changed, and really only in the last 10 or 20 years, actually, that the political activities of Thomas Mann in the now reunited Germany have come to be recognized as being actually important, not just an amateur dilettante fiddling around with lectures about democracy, but the efforts of somebody who actually accomplished something.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the beginning, if I may, to Thomas Mann's origins in North Germany, in Lübeck, in what you could think of as a sort of Hanseatic, maritime-looking, perhaps potentially more liberal part of Germany, and talk a little bit about that and about how that gets reflected in Buddenbrooks, which I suppose was his first significant accomplishment.
Yeah, so Thomas Mann was born in 1875 in the small, as you say, Hanseatic town of Lübeck on the Baltic shore, so very close to the border with Denmark. That's where he grows up in a well-to-do family. His father is a senator in Lübeck. And then as a young man, he doesn't even finish high school, but instead moves to Munich, Catholic Munich at the other end of Germany in the south of Munich, and begins his independent career as a writer. Munich at the time was the center of artistic activity in Germany. And if you wanted to be an artist of any kind, whether a writer or a painter or something like that, you just had to move away from the fairly, the small town provincialism, I guess, of Lübeck that Mann grew up in. But the city that he grew up in, at the North German, heavily Protestant, heavily sort of mercantile atmosphere that he grew up in, certainly stays with him. And his first true masterpiece, the novel Buddenbrooks, which is the one that would eventually was published in 1901, but it would eventually win him the Nobel Prize in 1929. So that first great masterpiece is entirely set in Lübeck. It deals with the story of a family over 4 generations in the 19th century. It is a novel that owes a lot to the realist tradition of the 19th century. It's in some sense has one eye back on the 19th century, but also one eye forward looking towards the literary innovations of the 20th century. You can find in it already many of the literary tools and devices that would make Thomas Mann such a great master of modernism in the 1920s. It's saturated with a depiction of Protestantism, of the Protestant work ethic, of capitalism as it develops over the course of the 19th century, oftentimes very sympathetic depictions of of that kind of life. I mean, Thomas Mann, like I said, fled his hometown, so to speak, for Munich, for Bohemian Munich, in order to become an artist. But he was never somebody who would have just renounced his roots. He was always very interested in the way in which his bourgeois upbringing had conditioned him as a person, and was very interested in articulating how art might relate back to ordinary bourgeois life, how art might also participate in civic life. I mean, this is something that then, in the 1920s, when he becomes interested in democracy, that I think makes him such an important person, because he does not believe that as an artist he should disengage himself from socio-political affairs. He thinks those two things intimately belong together, but he's also very skeptical about the inner validity of the 19th century sort of Protestant tradition that he grew up in. He believes that as modernity progresses further, that kind of moral rectitude in an ever increasingly complex life will become more and more difficult to maintain. And that's what he depicts in Buddenbrooks as well, which is a story about, the subtitle is The Decline of a Family. And it shows how from generation to generation, sort of the old values, the old inherited traditions, liberal traditions, Protestant traditions, become harder to maintain in the onrush of novel political formations, nationalism, but also modern sexuality, modern attitudes towards art, and so on.
I should add, his family are, they are very, I wouldn't say grand, but they're very renowned. There's lots of Wikipedia pages going back to the 17th century. So they really were amongst the sort of cream of that Hanseatic merchant elite.
Absolutely. It's a highly interesting, we could probably have an entire podcast episode just about Thomas Mann's various family members. He does not only come from an elite sort of German family, but it's also a family that then in the 20th century produces all these highly interesting intellectual figures, right? There's not just Thomas Mann, there's also his brother, who was Heinrich Mann, who was a really famous novelist in his own right. In Germany, is famous to this day. In the English-speaking world, not so much. He's probably best known in the English-speaking world as the person who wrote the novel that the film The Blue Angel with Marlene Dietrich is based on. Thomas Mann's children were all, or not all, but many of them, were serious intellectuals and writers in their own right. So yes, it's a very interesting family story, and one that he partly copied for Buddenbrooks. Buddenbrooks caused sort of a sensation when it was published, because so many people in it were immediately recognizable to people from Lübeck as actual historical personages, not just from Thomas Mann's own family, but also their neighbors and so on. It was a roman à clé, a novel that you could read and for gossip, right, to decipher the real life stories that were buried in there.
His son Klaus's book was banned after the war, wasn't it? Because it became too close. There was one figure who was obviously, so it was kind of libel.
Yes. Thomas Mann's eldest son, Claus, became a novelist in his own right. His most famous novel is called Mephistopheles. Again, one of those novels that is still read in Germany, not so much in the English-speaking world, and in the English-speaking world, remembered again through a film adaptation of it that was made in the 1980s, also called Mephistopheles. It's a great film worth checking out. Mephistopheles, as the title already implies, is a modern adaptation of the Faust story, which is something that fascinated the Thomas Mann family. Thomas Mann also wrote a novel based on the Faust legend. So the Faust legend, of course, is the legend of a figure who makes a pact with the devil, oftentimes for wealth and fame and fortune. Though that gets played with in the literary tradition, and eventually gets dragged to hell for it, right? And in Claus Mann's Mephistopheles, he transports the story to Germany of the 1930s, makes the Faust figure an actor who's very transparently modeled on the great German actor Gustav Gründgens, who actually had intense personal relationships with the Mann family. He was a frequent guest in their household. Gründgens obviously did not appreciate that kind of literary depiction. And yes, the novel was for a while banned as libelous in post-war Germany.
Before we get back to his early years, can I, because people might be curious about how the Nobel Prize in Literature gets awarded more than 20 years later after, but it was obviously a different system back then, because obviously now it's kind of current.
Well, I mean, the Nobel Prize then is now sort of awarded by a committee of worthies, right? Past Nobel laureates can make suggestions as to who should be nominated for the Nobel Prize. It's very non-transparent how the Nobel Prize actually gets selected. Certainly, the way in which the 1920s differ from our time today is that back then it was even more closeted, so to speak. It was even more behind closed doors. It's certainly odd that the Nobel Committee that awarded the prize to Mann in 1929 would have explicitly cited Buddenbrooks as the novel to win that achievement, especially in light of the fact that just 5 years earlier in 1924, Thomas Mann had published The Magic Mountain, which even at the time and certainly nowadays is, I think, almost universally recognized as his greatest literary achievement. So why Buddenbrooks and not The Magic Mountain? Well, I think the reason is quite simply that the Nobel Prize Committee at the time was very conservative, both politically and culturally speaking, and was uncomfortable with the modernism of The Magic Mountain and preferred I said earlier that that Buddenbrooks is a novel that has one eye, maybe more than one eye, cast backwards on the 19th century. That was simply more acceptable for them. But certainly, when it became time to market Thomas Mann in the United States, his publisher certainly had no qualms of linking the Nobel Prize very intimately with The Magic Mountain. The Magic Mountain was the novel that made Mann's career in the United States, because The Magic Mountain, written after the First World War, is a novel about how did the First World War become possible, what happened to European civilization that something as terrible as that could happen. What lessons do we draw from that? And that's the kind of thing that made Mann's reputation in the interwar years and allowed him to have that cultural prestige that then also made him an important anti-Nazi.
We're going to come back to Magic Mountain and also indeed to Thomas Mann's own take on the Faust legend. But before we get there, I suppose we haven't really got time to talk about his mother's origins, which of course are very different from his father's, a lot more exotic, we might say, and or that's probably a word he would have used. But I'd like now to talk about his move south, his marriage, and sort of center that around death in Venice, and perhaps talk a little bit about his sexuality and his family life.
Sure. So as I said earlier, Mann moved south to Munich in the early 1890s. Munich was the center of artistic life in Germany, was the center of the Boheme. It was also the center of a more loose sexual culture by the standards of the late 19th century. And Thomas Mann took all that in. He treated it in various of his early stories, but ultimately he knew from a fairly early age on that kind of life, that kind of bohemian lifestyle that many artists of his time led was not for him. He knew that he wanted to be a quote unquote serious artist, right? Somebody who wins the esteem not just of the kinds of people who are interested in avant-garde art, but that wins the esteem of a broader populace. And he realized that the way to get there was through a fairly traditional life, a life not unlike the one that he had seen his parents lead in Lübeck. And he knew that marriage was more important than anything else. Now, that is not a conclusion he would have had to arrive at, because as Paul, you already hinted at, Thomas Mann was homosexual. I hesitate to use the word gay or queer or something like that because he does not really fit the kinds of connotations that we have built around those terms in the 21st century. But he was certainly sexually attracted to men. Whether he was also sexually attracted to women, whether he was bisexual is a question that's open for debate, but we don't really find evidence for it in his diaries, whereas we do find ample evidence that he was attracted to men in those diaries. But he very deliberately decided to set that aside and pursue a traditional marriage, and he married into one of the most esteemed families in Munich. On some level, a strategic marriage, one could say, one of the most rich and also prestigious families in Munich. He married a woman named Katja Pringsheim, to whom he stayed married his entire life. By all intents and purposes, a very happy life. They had 6 children, so clearly they also had a sex life together.
I was going to say, he's actually gay, then 6 children's quite impressive.
Yeah, yes, it is.
Or you might say 6 children is the evidence for the fact that he probably wasn't entirely homosexual.
Well, I mean, perhaps. I'm not, I'm not in the business of speculating too much about people's sexuality. It is certainly true that, if you were of the generation that Mann was of, identifying as gay, that is an identity formation that only very gradually came into focus during Mann's own lifetime. And for somebody who was already middle-aged by the time that it really emerged into public discussion, I'm not sure it would even have been available to him as a category that he could have easily identified with. And in the absence of such categories, I mean, you just fulfill your duty, I guess. So, but ultimately, I don't think the question of what went on in the bedroom between Thomas and Katja is such a pertinent one, or even a very interesting one. The more interesting one, which you already pointed at with your question, is what does that then do for Thomas Mann's art, right? And here, you said we'd kind of skip over his family background, but want to touch on that with at least one sentence. So what you were alluding to is that Thomas Mann's mother was actually born in Brazil. So had sort of a somewhat exotic background, right? And Thomas Mann was very much aware of that. As I said earlier in the interview, he was somebody who was a little bit in between or torn between this bohemian lifestyle that he knew to be characteristic of artists, rejected for himself, and on the other hand, the traditional sort of Protestant German bourgeois lifestyle, which he also had issues with, but also recognized as necessary for career purposes. So the fact that he had this sort of mixed heritage parents, I think was very important for him, was something that stuck with him his entire life. And it also applies to his wife in a sense, because so his wife also came from a very traditional, established, wealthy, prestigious family, but his wife was also Jewish, right? And I don't think that's a coincidence necessarily. I think there was something about that duality that was very interesting to Thomas Mann. And he explored that duality in several different stories, by far the most famous of which is Death in Venice, which together with Magic Mountain, which we mentioned a little earlier already, is probably the text of Mann's that is best known in the English-speaking world, that oftentimes serves as an inroad into Thomas Mann's oeuvre. I mean, it's relatively short, less than 100 pages, I'd say. So very accessible. It's oftentimes, I don't know about Britain, but here in the United States, it's oftentimes still taught college level and survey courses. So for many people, it's sort of the first encounter with Thomas Mann. And it is a story about an artist who's not at all unlike Thomas Mann, named Gustav von Aschenbach. In fact, if you read the description of von Aschenbach in the early pages of the novella very carefully, you find all sorts of allusions to Thomas Mann's own life. I mean, it's not a biographical depiction, but he put a lot of himself into that figure. And Gustav von Aschenbach is at the height of his career, at a point that Thomas Mann was still striving for at that point of his life. He has accomplished everything that Thomas Mann is aiming for, but he hits a creative crisis. He just can't, he has writer's block. He can't go on with his current story. So he decides to vacation in the south, eventually hits on Venice as a place to vacation in. It's obviously a symbolically overdetermined place, lots of associations that we have. For Mann's context, I think one of the most important ones is that the 18th century art theoretician Winkelmann died in Venice, possibly as a result of a homosexual tryst. And that is something that Mann picks up on. He leads Gustav von Aschenbach into this grand hotel in Venice, where his eyes hit upon a beautiful young boy. He discovers that he has fallen in love with that young boy, and that love, which he never acts upon, except for my contemporary students' incredibly creepy way of constantly following the young boy around and, looking at him and so on. But there's certainly never, not even like words exchanged between the two of them. So that eventually becomes Aschenbach's undoing because, as it turns out, Venice is in the grip of a cholera epidemic. And Aschenbach, even though he could leave, decides to stay because he's so much in love and eventually dies of the cholera because of that. So that's it's incredibly complex story. So I'm doing it injustice by calling it an overt allegory, but it is in a sense an overt allegory on these tensions that we've talked about before. On the one hand, the need to remain rooted in a traditional, respectable bourgeois life. That alone is what gives you solidity, gives you backbone, also gives you a career. But then on the other hand, the flirtation with these sort of marginal elements, including sexually marginalized elements at the time in early 20th century Europe, that allow you to think outside the box, so to speak, right? To leave your bourgeois upbringing behind, to think like an artist, to explore new topics.
What was the reaction to the death of Venice? Was there not a sense of disgust and unease, or
it was a mixed reaction. No, there was not a widespread outcry or anything of that sort. There were certainly some critics who were disaffected by the tale. One of my favorite reviews is in an American newspaper where the reviewer simply changed the identity of Taju, the young boy that Aschenbach falls in love with, into a young girl. and in the plot summary in the review tells this as a heterosexual love affair. It's a little unclear whether the repression was so strong that they actually convinced themselves that this was a girl. Not that, given the age difference, not that would have been that much better. Yes, absolutely. I don't know whether we want to delve into the question of whether Death in Venice is going to be, as new generations of readers discover Thomas Mann, I oftentimes wonder whether Death in Venice will play as central a part as it did in the old days. Certainly, when I teach it to my own students, I find that every time that I teach it, the resistances that need to be overcome are greater. And I think with good reason. It's a great tale, and I would hate for students no longer to discover it on its literary merits and on the very complex merits that the story does have. But it is also a very problematic tale for the kinds of things that it leaves unquestioned. The way that it projects a Platonic framework onto the Platonic in the sense of alluding to the ancient Greek dialogues, right? There's a lot of Greek stuff overlayered there. To what extent is that obfuscation, right? At the end of the day, we are dealing with a story about a 50-year-old man who falls in love with, if I remember correctly, a 14-year-old boy. There's something decidedly problematic about that. And I suspect that going forward, probably Death in Venice will no longer have quite the same canonical status as it did in the past. But fortunately, there are plenty of other interesting sides to Thomas Mann that I think still remain to be discovered.
You mentioned Winckelmann dying in Venice, and it makes me think of another famous death in Venice, which of course was Wagner's. And perhaps we can say a few words before we move on to Magic Mountain about that great nexus of Wagner, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, and how their thinking affected the whole intellectual climate and literary climate of the day, but specifically how Mann reacted to it.
Yeah, so that's a very complicated story. First of all, I have to correct myself. Winckelmann didn't actually die in Venice. I believe he died in Trieste, which is very close to Venice and actually plays a role in Death in Venice as well, but not in Venice proper. When it comes to the relationship between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, those were the intellectual lodestars for Thomas Mann, right? So he was very much influenced by 19th century philosophy, 19th century music as well. Wagner, you mentioned, was also incredibly important to him. Wagner shaped his his literary techniques, perhaps more than any novelist did, in the sense that Mann is now most famous for adopting Wagner's leitmotif technique that, if you've ever listened to the Ring Cycle, you are familiar with. He adapted that for fiction. Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, which you mentioned explicitly, remained important for his entire life as well. Nietzsche, of course, was sort of a guiding spirit for modernists in almost any country, right? Because the radical questioning of established pieties, the view of language as a mobile army of metaphors, as Nietzsche called it at one point, right, is very important to the modernists. So he shared that with a number of other people. He also shared later in life the distrust of an altogether too comfortable embrace of German nationalism. In terms of Schopenhauer, Schopenhauer's quintessential pessimism and his fatalism almost are something that influenced Thomas Mann as well. Thomas Mann had a deeply tragic view of the world. You'd be hard-pressed to find stories and novels by Thomas Mann that end happily. There are some. The most famous ones all end tragic, oftentimes with the sense that the entire universe is sort of aligned against the protagonist. I think that also comes from that tradition. That particular influence of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche on a writer in the early 20th century is something that he shares in the English tradition with Joseph Conrad, who's another novelist whom Thomas Mann greatly admired. He only discovered him in the 1920s when Conrad was already dead. So there was never any exchange between the two of them. But Mann immediately recognized a kindred spirit in Conrad, and I think for good reason. And among other things, the fact that they share intellectual forebears.
Let's move on to talk about the post-First World War period, and specifically to tackle the Magic Mountain, which I must admit I've tried to read 3 times. And the third time I made it up to the summit, and a very magnificent view I got from there. But it was quite hard work. And in a sense, I think Death in Venice, to me, it's infused with the spirit of the Liebestod, that Wagnerian sense, which in some ways is rather decadent. And in some ways you can see, and this is a hugely complex topic, leading up to the First World War, the sort of inherent, almost inevitable decline or collapse of a sort of European civilization. So we now find ourselves in the post-World War I era, and he produces this extraordinary masterpiece, yes, hard work, but very rewarding. It seems to tell us something about Western civilization. Indeed, it's interesting that it is about a mountain, and it is, of course, from mountain tops that one gets the most panoramic view. What was the panoramic view of Western civilization from the perspective of the 1920s that Mann was trying to convey in Magic Mountain?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I like the metaphor of the mountaintop that you use, both because, yes, you have to ascend to the mountain, but then once you're up there, it's rather cold and inhospitable, and eventually you have to come back down as well, right? So those are, I think, aspects of the metaphor that are relevant to Magic Mountain as well. Let me start, if it's okay, with quick plot summary again, as I did with Death in Venice. The Magic Mountain is the story of a young man named Hans Castorp, who, again, doesn't bear explicit resemblance to Thomas Mann, but like Thomas Mann himself, he comes from a Hanseatic family in the north of Germany, and he goes south, but in this case, not to a center of civilization, namely Munich, but to a tuberculosis sanatorium in Davos, Switzerland, right? At the time, prior to the invention of penicillin, the Swiss Alps were renowned, as I guess they are today, for their medical facilities and especially for their tuberculosis sanatoria. And Hans Castorp goes there on a brief sort of sabbatical, almost of sorts, before he is supposed to begin a reputable career, to visit his cousin, who is a patient in this tuberculosis sanatorium. And he falls under the spell of the sanatorium culture and ends up staying for 7 years until the First World War breaks out, and the novel ends by him being drafted. And we famously lose sight of him on the battlefields of World War I, where he is probably killed. The sanatorium culture that the novel describes pretty quickly emerges as an allegory or as a panoramic portrait, as I think you called it, of pre-war European society. So there are people, I mean, all rich people, of course, given the nature of the place, but there are people from all over Europe in the sanatorium. They interact with one another in oftentimes comical fashion. There's not a lot to do, so there are a lot of sort of love triangles and stuff like that. A lot of good food gets consumed. But most importantly, and this is what makes the novel both very difficult, but I hope also interesting, are the conversations, the intellectual conversations that Hans Castorp has with a number of different people.
And of course, they're all sick and they're all dying, right? The food's great, the views are great.
They are all sick, or in some cases maybe imagine themselves to be sick, right? I think this is just as important for the novel context and also for the allegory. It doesn't matter whether society is actually sick. If it imagines itself to be sick, bad things will happen, right? I mean, that's one way in which reactionary forces come to the foreground, is that they convince a society which may well be healthy that actually things are not right. So it's not always clear whether everybody is sick or not. Certainly with Hans Castorp himself, that is very much an open question. They have these conversations. They don't debate politics in any kind of topical sense, but on a more abstract level, they debate, are human beings meant for liberal social structures? The values of the Enlightenment, can they be upheld in the 20th century? Is it not rather the case that we need that human beings essentially think of themselves through collective terms rather than through individualistic terms, as traditional liberalism presupposes? These kinds of questions that are more perhaps aligned with political philosophy than with a standard discussion of events that might have led to the outbreak of World War I. Those are at the foreground of the book. I think your ability or whether you still find much of value in that discussion in the 21st century depends to a certain degree on your capacity for abstracting from those arguments and applying them to our present day and age. Let me give you one example. One of my favorite scenes in The Magic Mountain occurs between two characters named Settembrini and Nafta, who are sort of central intellectual interlocutors for Hans Castorp. Settembrini represents the values of liberalism and of the Enlightenment. Nafta is a highly complex figure who combines communist elements with pre-fascist elements, with the Catholic Church, with elements of Judaism. I mean, he's a very improbable and, to some sense, if you parse it out, almost ridiculous character. But he represents everything that is not liberal, right? He represents the communal values that are at the heart in different ways of communism, Catholicism, and fascism. And that gets him into constant conflict with Settembrini. And eventually things get so bad that the two decide to have a duel, at which Settembrini, who gets the first shot, makes the decision to fire into the air, right? Because as an Enlightenment liberal, the idea of shooting somebody over an intellectual disagreement is abhorrent, is completely ridiculous to him. That's a strong gesture. It seems you have the opportunity to do grievous harm to your opponent, possibly neutralize them. He doesn't do it, even though it puts his own life in danger. That seems like a really strong gesture. Nafta, instead of shooting at Settembrini or shooting in the air or just complaining about what happens, shoots himself with his pistol. And in that sort of move, sort of ends up defeating Settembrini after all, because how does Settembrini come back from that kind of utmost rejection of rationality, of cherishing the individual human being? How do you respond to that? And to me, that's, we live in time where liberals the world over, seems to me, also find it next to impossible to formulate a rational response to frequently highly irrational elements that happen in society around them, right? I mean, the upcoming U.S. elections are an obvious example of this? How, in the face of this almost sort of rabid populism that is driving the Trump campaign, how do you respond to that if you want to make arguments based on reason, right? Arguments that we should be striving to increase human freedom for everyone, that we should not let collective identities predetermine us. Liberalism seems impossible to come back with a response to that. And that I see very much dramatized in that particular exchange. And that's why I think that Magic Mountain remains, as it happens, it's the 100-year anniversary of the Magic Mountain this year, right? So in the German-speaking world, there's all sorts of celebrations related to that, all sorts of academic conferences, all sorts of articles being printed in the feuilleton, in the cultural pages in German newspapers. And that, I think, is a way in which Thomas Mann's writings from the early 20th century can possibly still speak to us in a way that maybe others like Death in Venice no longer do quite as direct.
Tobias, can I ask you about, he's not someone who is subject to what we'd call audience capture now. I mean, the tendency towards going along with your supporters and moving to them politically. I mean, in the First World War, he started off, he was a supporter of German Empire, and at least from the Magician, one gets the impression he becomes more and more popular with German nationalists, while his brother becomes more and more an opponent in the war. But it would have surely been easier for him to then continue to become more right-wing after the war, so to speak, as presumably lots of his fans would have been, in that kind of shock and kind of dismay of defeat. But he goes the opposite way now.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. That would have been the expected course of action for him, certainly the path of least resistance. And in fact, one of the most interesting things as I wrote my book about Thomas Mann's political development was to look at the diaries of Joseph Goebbels, right, who very clearly, up until around 1930 or so, still held up hope that Thomas Mann might be brought back into the Nazi fold, right? Might be turned into a supporter of the Nazis, simply because his cultural esteem was so great that the Nazis would have loved to win him for their cause. And it's really only in the late 1920s, I mentioned his famous talk in 1923, when he turns towards the German Republic. It's only at the end of the 1920s, and I believe it may have been 1930, that he gives a lecture in advance of elections in Germany, where he explicitly calls on people to reject Hindenburg, to reject the right-wing elements in German society. So why doesn't he do it? That's a really sort of great question. It's not one that I have an easy answer to. I mean, one would like to hope that personal integrity counts for something. It's also the case that he was sort of disgusted with the Nazis on a visceral sort of aesthetic level. I mean, he realized from very early on what sort of intellectually banal, barbaric, and brutal people these really were. And that went against his grain to a deep degree.
This is just on Wikipedia, but he criticizes Hitler's artistic tastes. I don't know how much that is a joke or is...
Yeah, so what you're probably alluding to is an essay that comes a lot later. I mean, he was no fan of Hitler even during the 1920s. But the article that you're alluding, or the essay that you're alluding to, is Brother Hitler from 1938. So he writes that when he's already in exile. It's a brutal portrait of Hitler for sure, whom he characterizes as a failed artist. That, for Thomas Mann, is really essential to understanding what is going on with the Nazis. For him, the whole Nazi approach to politics is born from Hitler's failure of having established himself as a painter. For Thomas Mann, the Nazi propaganda techniques are basically art on a almost ridiculous and on a reduced level applied to politics, right? The Nazi mass rallies are essentially theatrical stagings, the way that Thomas Mann sees them, and I think he's right about that. So Mann claims that because Hitler couldn't hack it as a real artist, he turned to a political artist, to be a political artist, and unfortunately discovered himself to be a genius in that field and had very real negative effects on German society. But the important part to understand, and this is what I think makes Thomas Mann such an intellectually interesting figure, is that Mann recognizes that something very similar could easily have happened to him as well, right? He recognizes that the fact that Hitler is so good at manipulating the masses through essentially artistic means shows that Hitler is not altogether unlike Thomas Mann, right? They have similar talents. And that is an idea that in the 1940s, then Mann would greatly develop and expand upon when he eventually arrives by the end of the Second World War on what I think is his central, or the central idea, political idea that Thomas Mann formulated in his life. Maybe the only timeless political idea that we still need to pay attention to, which is that it won't do for us to think of the Nazis as being completely separate from other Germans, from German identity, of being somehow evil, corrupt, diseased, whatever. But rather he recognizes that the very things that made German culture great were able, in a sort of twist of the screw, to be perverted into evil, as happened with Hitler, right?
And I think that's a good place to move towards wrapping up, but specifically to talk about Dr. Faustus, something I know you're working on, and that seems an appropriate conclusion. So tell us about what you're doing on Dr. Faustus and how that throws light on the very point you were just making.
Yeah, so I'm currently writing an introductory volume on Dr. Faustus for an English language readership, because I think it's amongst Thomas Mann's novels, it's one that really deserves rediscovery and reappraisal by audiences in the English-speaking world. But it's a very hard novel, and a novel that takes a lot of knowledge about German culture for granted that I've discovered in teaching it here at Notre Dame, that a lot of younger Americans simply don't have. But Dr. Faustus is, as the title implies, and we mentioned this earlier already, that's Thomas Mann's take on the Faustus tale, on the idea of a man who makes a pact with the devil and pays a terrible price for it. But his take on that material is a lot more complex than the take that his son Claus had. For Claus, it was really, he just wanted to show how prominent Germans could become corrupted and support Nazism. Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus is a German composer who really has no overt relationship with politics whatsoever, but who does want to rescue 19th century German art music, classical music, from a perceived crisis, and in so doing is at least tacitly willing to forge a pact with the devil that allows him to then, it's a very complicated story, but he ends up as the inventor of 12-tone music and writes pieces in that vein as a means of continuing to glorify German art. And the novel is set in the first half from about 1900 to about 1930, so the exact time in which the Nazis sort of gradually rose to power, or in which the nationalist elements in German society that made Nazism possible became prominent and rose to power. And Thomas Mann depicts various cultural and intellectual circles in Germany at the time and shows how there is this slide away from liberal bourgeois 19th century culture to something altogether different. But he also shows how the desire to contribute to German cultural greatness, to become the next figure in this line of great German composers, from Bach to Brahms and beyond, how this very desire to place yourself in that lineage can lead to terrible perversion, which in the case of Adrian Leverkühn is a total disavowal of any kind of social life of recognizing that one is, as an artist and as an intellectual, one is by necessity always also part of the fabric of social reality. That is something that Adrian Leverkühn sort of rejects as an idea. He lives a hermit's life. So the novel thereby tries to dramatize how the quest for German cultural greatness can be perverted in the confines of the allegory by the intervention of the devil.
Tobias, that's a wonderful summary, and I'm sure all our listeners are looking forward to your forthcoming book. And in the meanwhile, there's lots and lots of Thomas Mann for them to be getting on and reading. Thank you so much for your time.